In this video, I'm going to be painting some 1/35th scale tankers from Gecko Models. So stick around as I take you through every aspect of painting the figures, from the flesh tones, to shading and highlighting the uniforms, and maybe even a pair of socks. I'm James, and you're watching LPJ Models. Because this is a painting video, construction will be kept to a minimum. So some snipping, some gluing, and some priming. The figures did need a fair amount of cleanup, but it was nothing a scalpel couldn't fix. And the figures were primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. Let's go over the colours I'm going to be using for this video. I'm going to be mostly using Vallejo model colour with some AK 3rd Gen. The AK colours I'm using are Smoke Black, Very Dark Brown and Olive Drab. From Vallejo I'm going to be using Light Flesh, Medium Flesh Tone, Cork Brown, Hull Red, Brass, Russian Uniform, English Uniform, Carmine Red, Violet Red and Black. These are the colours I used for the flesh tones laid out on my wet palette. These are grouped roughly from palest to darkest, and this image should give you a good idea of how I mix and how thin my paints are. When painting flesh, I like to start with a darker base tone, so for this I mixed up some Hull Red with some Cork Brown. This will probably get completely covered, but it's how most of the time I start my flesh tones. So let's take these figures from the one on the left to the one on the right. A quick note, I'm using a selection of 20 Kolinsky sables. I'm going to start by painting in some thin layers of the flesh midtones. These were mixed from Cork Brown and Medium Flesh Tone. These early layers are quite thin and will look quite sketchy until the opacity is built up. The idea is to paint a rough guide of the shadows and the highlights before refining them later on. So after 2 or 3 sketchy mid-flesh tone layers were complete, it was time to start sketching in some of the highlights. To my previous mix of Cork Brown and Medium Flesh Tone, I added a touch of Carmine Red and a touch of Light Flesh. I'm using this to start to bring out the highlights, painting this along areas such as the brow, the nose, the cheekbones. Oh, and don't forget the ears. I always forget the ears. And because we're painting the whole figure and not just the face, this method is also used on the limbs. So on this figure we've got some forearms and some knees to paint. Now I'm going to start adding some provisional shadows. I'm taking my mix of Cork Brown and Medium Flesh Tone and adding some Hull Red to it. This is being painted on areas of the face and body that will be shaded the most. So underneath the arms, the back of the legs, underneath the eyebrows, around the nose and the neck. When painting previous desert figures, I didn't make them warm or sunburnt enough, so this time I prepared a glaze of Medium Flesh Tone and Carmine Red. This is just a very thin, transparent layer of paint, and will be used to blend in some of the darker and brighter highlights and shadows on the face, as well as add a golden tone to the skin. At this stage the figure still does look quite sketchy, but like I said, I find figure painting a very back and forth process. So let's redefine some of those shadows. As we move through the stages, the paint application becomes more considered and more precise. So as I'm painting this next shadow layer, I'm taking a lot more time and care. As well as re-establishing the shadows on the facial features of the figure, I'm also adding a slight shadow around the beret. Let's reintroduce some more highlights to the figure. I added a little more light flesh than before to this mix to make the highlights pop a little more. This again was painted on the extremes of the face where the light would catch the most. I apologise for some of the sections that aren't quite in focus. Because the depth of field was so shallow, if I moved the figure a centimetre forward, it would start to go blurry. But I hope these sections are still clear enough for you to see what's going on. Once these lighter shades of flesh were painted, you guessed it, it's back to some shadows, but this time I mixed some Carmine Red with some Hull Red to add some warmer, deep shadow tones. You should be starting to see that this back and forth process is starting to turn this figure's face into something somewhat human. This shot also shows you how thin my shadow paint is. It's slightly thicker than a wash, and I'm slightly dabbing it into the surface to make it blend in. Every now and again I'll introduce a glaze of my sunburn tone, Medium Flesh Tone and Carmine Red, to homogenise the overall look of the flesh on the face. Now we're back with some even brighter highlights. My previous highlight mix was used, but again with more light flesh. Because I don't want these highlights to go out of control, I'm using very little paint and very tiny motions with the brush. And of course, don't forget the ears. The highlights and shading are really starting to bring the figure to life. Let's give the figure another glaze of my sunburn tone and see where we're at. A quick note, I didn't bother with the eyes for this figure, because a lot of people don't like painting the eyes, and it's understandable, they're really tricky, so I just focused on getting decent flesh tones. Again, I added another layer of highlights. I really wasn't messing around when I was telling you about this back and forth process. It might take a little more time, but I really like the results. So here I'm reinforcing the nose, the brow and the cheekbones, and the chin. And the whole face and flesh is starting to look a lot tidier. What's next? Some more shadows. Sorry, we're nearly at the end of the flesh painting process. This time I'm mixing in some violet red with my hull red. Blues and purples can push back features and details on a figure, so there does tend to be some purple on all the figures I paint. And as we're at the final stages of the face, these brush strokes need to be really precise. And this is where quality brushes really come into their own. I felt the face needed a tiny bit more lift, so I went back in with some highlights again. They do look more blown out on the camera than in real life, so in person they are a little more subtle. And you can see here that all that back and forth wasn't for nothing. The sketchy look of the figure has completely gone, and what we've got left is a nicely blended and layered face. The transitions are pretty smooth, and I really like the colours I've been using, which is a more stripped down palette than I would usually use, mainly to make this video a bit easier to follow. But I hope I haven't lost you with all this back and forth between shadows and highlights. One detail I like to add with figures is to pick out the knuckles on the fingers. This helps the hands to look more realistic and a little less plastic model-y. And that's the flesh tones complete. I've had people say in the past that my figures look quite pale, so I've taken that on board, and hopefully, with these warmer flesh tones, they look a bit better. You'll have to let me know what you think in the comments. Right, shall we paint some uniforms? For the tans of the uniforms I'm using light flesh, medium flesh tone, English uniform, cork brown, very dark brown and smoke black. Again arranged lightest to darkest from left to right. For the mid-tone of the figure, I mixed together some medium flesh tone and cork brown and a touch of English uniform for saturation. Like with the flesh tones, the uniform will look sketchy until the highlights and the shadows are complete. For the base coats on the uniform, I'm using a slightly larger brush just to speed up the process slightly. I also applied 2 to 3 coats just to get a reasonable opacity. Let's start the highlights and shading by adding some highlights. To my previous uniform mix, I added some more medium flesh tone and some light flesh to start the highlighting process. These were blocked in on all the raised areas of the figure that would have caught the sun. Usually I paint any raised areas and protrusions, with a focus on areas that point upwards. I also do this on detailed areas like pockets. While they might still be in a shadowy area, I still want the detail to pop. And like with the face, the brush strokes on these initial stages of the shadows and highlights are quite broad, before being refined later down the line. To darken up the uniform colour, I'm using smoke black, very dark brown, mixed in with English uniform. At this stage, the very dark brown and smoke black is a small proportion of the mix. And I'm now starting to block in the areas that would likely to be shaded. So at the bottom of deep creases, and in areas like underneath the arms, and between the legs and folds of the shorts. The front of uniforms always have a little more complexity, because you've usually got pockets and buttons and things like that to deal with. So if you really want your figures to pop, just take a little more care when painting the details on the front. Again, this is a back and forth process, so we're going back to some highlights. A little more light flesh is added to the mix, and details and raised areas are being picked out. I found the details on these figures to be particularly soft, so I did have to refine some of the details with a scalpel blade. I didn't go into that because I wanted this to just be a painting tutorial, but because of this we have to be a bit more careful with our painting. On resin figures the detail is usually a bit more crisp, so with plastic figures we still kind of have to exaggerate the details. That's why these shadows and highlights are so important. Back to the shadows, I did some outlining around the details on the front of the figure, just to make them pop a bit more. For the more extreme highlights on the uniform, I mixed some cork brown, medium flesh tone and light flesh, with a bias towards medium flesh tone and light flesh. This was used to pick out the extremities of the highlighted areas. Again, as I move on throughout the shading and highlighting process, I'm being more precise with my paint application. To add some variations to the shorts, I used a little bit more English uniform in my mixes, but the process was repeated pretty much the same as the upper half of the uniform, with sketchy layers that will later be tightened up. This clip is quite good because it shows up how I build up the highlights in an impressionist kind of way. For the shadows on the shorts, I leaned in heavily to English uniform, pretty much using it on its own, albeit highly thinned, for the first layers of the shadows. And for the highlights, I just used medium flesh tone and light flesh, increasing the amount of light flesh as I moved up through the shades. For the deeper shadows on the shorts, I used English uniform, very dark brown, smoke black, with a touch of violet red to help push the details back. I increased the amount of violet red for the deepest shadows on the shorts. And here's how the flesh and the uniform together look. And he's not looking too shabby if I say so myself. To protect all my hard work for the next stages, I'm giving the figure a layer of VMS matte varnish. Strangely, I always find a matte varnish brings together the highlights and the shading, kind of blending it all in a little bit more, and helping to hide some of the brush strokes. Because these figures are going to be used in a post-war setting, they're the only option I had, the belts are going to be painted green. To base coat the belts, I'm using olive drab and Russian uniform. Oh, as a quick note, to add variety to the figures, I painted the shorts on one of them with Russian uniform. To add a slight highlight to the belt, I mixed in some medium flesh tone to my green mix. This was painted on the top of the belt, just to simulate a bit of depth. And a shadow colour with smoke black added to my green mix was painted along the centre and on the lower portions of the belt. For the socks, I mixed up a dirty sandy grey with medium flesh tone, smoke black and light flesh. This was used to base coat the socks and was given about 2 layers. Having the socks slightly paler might not be 100% accurate, but it will help add a little accent to the slightly monotone figures. For some reason I don't use dry brushing very often, but I decided to dry brush the details in the raised areas of the socks. This was done with a very pale mix of light flesh and medium flesh tone. The socks were then shaded and detailed with a mix of medium flesh tone, light flesh with some smoke black. This was applied as kind of a wash, so the darker paint would settle into the recesses and make the socks look more three-dimensional. And for the final shadows on the socks, I mixed some smoke black with some violet red. I use this to outline the areas between the socks and the legs, under the folds of the socks, and between the socks and the boot. The braces on the boots were painted with very dark brown mixed with smoke black. With painting these details, you've got to be really careful not to get any paint on areas you've previously painted. Easier said than done. These were highlighted by adding a touch of medium flesh tone to the mix. The boots were painted with smoke black. These were going to be slightly dusty, so the base colour didn't matter too much. When they were dry, I added a wash mixed from smoke black and English uniform. Any further dusting will be done when I blend them to the future diorama base. But for now, this is a good starting point. The only time I used the pure Vallejo black for this build was on the beret. This was based in black. In photos, these always looked pretty tidy, so apart from some highlights, I made this look pretty clean. For highlighting black, pink is usually the highlight colour of choice, because white makes the grey look too pasty. So for the highlights on the beret, I mixed in a touch of light flesh to my previous Vallejo black and brushed this on all the raised areas, leaving some shading on the top of the beret, just to make it look more visually interesting. This was finished with a semi-dry brushed layer of a lighter shade of my black highlight mix. The cap badge was based with English uniform. This was used as it was a similar base colour to the next colour I'm going to be using, which is Vallejo brass. This was touched lightly onto the cap badge before being given a very slight wash in the centre of brass mixed with black, just to simulate some detail. The final step was to give this figure a nice cup of tea. The cup that came with the kit didn't look very good, so I scratch built my own. This was then filled with UV resin and some paint to make it look like a proper bevy, and then glued into place with VMS super glue. And that rounds up my tutorial on painting British tankers. I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting my work. Your support is much appreciated. This video was a bit different because I wanted to show every step of my painting process. So because of that, it's fairly long and it might be a little bit clunky, you know, with all those back and forths between shadows and highlights. But that's something you don't often see with YouTube videos. And I don't think figure painting is as simple as regimented highlighting and shading. I think there's always some back and forth, and that's not often shown. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you did. And as you probably picked up on, these are going to be used in a future diorama, so keep your eyes peeled for that. It would really help me out if you enjoyed my videos to hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a like or a dislike and a comment. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. I'll see you in the next one.